Welcome to SarderTV. I'm Vaishali Jain. We have the pleasure of having James Lamb in the studio with us today. James is a risk professional serving on both public and private boards, and he's the founder of his own risk management consultancy. He's also an author, and he is a board member for E-Trade, an online brokerage firm, and he's here to tell us more. James, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So, E-Trade has an interesting turnaround story as it was almost on the brink of collapse in 2007. Tell us about that story and what was going on.
Well, when I joined E-Trade's board about 4 years ago, in November of 2012, it was in the middle of the turnaround. So prior to the financial crisis of 2008, E-Trade made the classic strategic mistake, right? They were an online brokerage and they moved out of that to do more banking operations and invested in mortgage-backed securities at the worst possible time. So suffered a lot of losses and really had to be turned around. I joined right in the middle of that. And at that point, I think the company's stock was about $8 a share. Debt rating was about single B. We were under 2 MOUs from our primary regulators, and we were undercapitalized. So the company took a lot of actions to turn around the company, and I was brought in to chair the risk committee to help them set up an enterprise risk management program to make sure that it doesn't happen again.
Now, you said you were brought in around 2012 as a board member of E-Trade, right as the company was starting to go through its turnaround process.
Yes.
Tell us why you were brought in and what your role was.
Well, the company was in the early stages of setting up an enterprise risk management program. So we needed to resolve the regulatory issues. So those 2 MOUs had a lot of regulatory requirements that we needed to meet. We also wanted to make sure that the enterprise risk management program is sound, is robust, and is effective. And then we wanted to make sure that the board's getting the right information, the right reporting, so we could provide oversight on that risk management program. So we met very regularly. We worked with management at a very collaborative basis. And so far, if you look at the objective results, I think we are moving in the right direction. So our stock went from about $8 a share to over $30 a share. Our debt rating went from single B to triple B. We got under the 2 MOUs in 2015, and we went from an undercapitalized position to the point where we are buying back stock. So based on the objective evidence, we are moving in the right direction. But risk management is something that you never say, mission accomplished. It's always an ongoing process. We have to deal with other things like strategic risk management and cybersecurity and other emerging risks that we face.
Prior to E-Trade, you served on the board of 2 private companies, one of which you found.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about those companies?
I served on 2 software companies. One was eRisk, which was a risk management software and consulting company. And the other company was Coverity, was a Canadian-based company, and that was also in the credit risk software area. So that was in Canada.
And which one of those companies is the one that you founded?
I founded eRisk. So I joined Oliver Wyman as a senior partner, and it was entrepreneurial venture. So we set up this company, we got external funding, and then we spun it off after we were able to be independent.
So tell us about your role as independent director and chairman of the risk committee at E-Trade and what you're responsible for.
I'm an independent director. I chair the risk oversight committee, and that was the job that I was brought in to do. And I'm also a member of the audit committee. And as the chair of the risk committee, our job is to provide risk governance and oversight. Management's job is to manage risk day to day. And we want to make sure that we provide effective governance, effective challenge, and effective risk oversight. So we want to make sure that we respect the role of management, but at the same time, we have a fiduciary responsibility to the shareholder to make sure that the company is operating in a safe and sound manner.
How do you balance that, the aspect of letting them sort of run the show, but you work in the back and help manage that? Is that a fine balance that you find you have to maintain?
It is a very fine balance. You want to be engaged, right? You don't want to be too removed, and and ask the right questions, ask the tough questions, and challenge management in terms of what they do and what their recommendations are. But at the same time, you don't want to be in the weeds and micromanage. So it is a fine challenge, and I think we strike that by setting the right standards, setting the right policies, and making sure that we get the right reporting and communication from management.
What are some of the biggest risks that organizations face today?
Well, the thing about risk is it's always evolving, right? The biggest risk any company faces is strategic risk, right? Do we have the right strategy? Do we have the right business model? Are we executing against that strategy appropriately? So it doesn't matter what industry you're in, that is the biggest risk. So when you look at the empirical research, when companies get into trouble, about 60% of the times due to strategic risk, 30% of the times due to operational risk, and 10% of the times due to financial risk. So the biggest risk for most companies is strategic risk, but you have to worry about operational risk, credit market, liquidity risk, and one of the biggest risks today, I think, is geopolitical uncertainty, right, in the world, and also cybersecurity. So those are kind of emerging risks that companies need to address as well.
Can you describe the differences between those risks, strategic risk, operational risk, and financial risk?
Strategic risk is the risk of having the appropriate business model, having the appropriate strategy, and executing against that. Operational risks are the risks that relate to process, people, technology, and external events. Financial risks deal with credit risk, market risk, counterparty risk, and also liquidity risk. So those are the key risks, but those risks don't live in silos. They have interdependencies, and that's why companies need to set up an enterprise risk management program to be able to look at it holistically and also be able to address the interdependencies.
Now, you mentioned cyber risk as well. Tell us why cyber risk is so important today.
Well, I think it's unlike any other risk that we've ever seen, both in terms of scope and scale. Right? It's a big problem. I think estimates are that cybersecurity costs about $500 billion a year. And in 2019, it's estimated to go to $2 trillion. And if you represent that as a stock market valuation, it would be like the 6th or 7th largest stock market in the world, right? So it's a huge problem. And with the Internet of Things, mobile and everything else, the number of points, the number of exposures are increasing very dramatically. So there are a lot of different elements that make cybersecurity especially challenging. But at the same time, it is a risk. Every risk has exposure, probability, severity, and correlations. So that's why I think cybersecurity should be part of an ERM program, enterprise risk management program, as opposed to being treated in its own silo.
The part of your job as a board member and the chair of the Risk Oversight Committee is to evaluate the performance of the Chief Risk Officer. Tell us what the role of the Chief Risk Officer is.
Well, the Chief Risk Officer is the organizational leader for enterprise risk management. And I think first and foremost, he or she should have the courage to push back on management if they're going in a direction that the company shouldn't go, whether it is taking on excessive risk or some kind of ethical or compliance issues. So I think just in terms of day-to-day management, providing that safeguard, having the courage to push back is an attribute that's very important. The other key responsibilities is to provide organizational leadership to make sure that the company is moving in the right direction with respect to its enterprise risk management program, making sure that you have the right people, the right process and technology in place, addressing day-to-day issues, risk events, regulatory events, specific losses or incidents, so responding to issues, another key role, and also working with the board, making sure that the board is well served in its governance and oversight responsibilities, providing it with good reporting measurements.
Have you found that the chief risk officer is becoming more of a common role in organizations?
It is. So I was first chief risk officer in 1993, and that role I think has become pervasive in financial services companies. And other companies, like in energy, technology, risk-intensive companies, that role has, I think, is becoming much more pervasive.
Do you feel that every industry could benefit today from having a chief risk officer?
Well, risk-intensive businesses, highly regulated industries, I think it really makes sense to consider a chief risk officer and also consider a risk committee of the board. But I think any company in any industry should at least think about it. And if you don't have a specific chief risk officer, you need to answer the question, who's the de facto chief risk officer? Is it a CFO? Is it the auditor? Is it a treasurer? Someone should be able to look at risk across the enterprise.
Mm-hmm. So which other industries do you feel would benefit from it, aside from the financial industry?
Energy firms, logistics firms, infrastructure, technology, pharmaceuticals, companies that are large, complex. I think any organization with over $1 billion in revenue should at least consider that role.
Have you found that there are some industries that don't use a chief risk officer that really should be, or specific companies that you found?
Yeah, I would say government entities, right? I think they could definitely use chief risk officers, and we've seen that. Department of Health and Services after the disaster with the website, right, for Obamacare. You've seen that in the Treasury Department. You're starting to see it in other government services organizations. And I think it's really important that if you have a policy or a program, that you think about the risk, you think about whether it's meeting its organizational and mandate objectives, and if not, how do you mitigate those risks? I think government services should have more of a risk management mindset.
Now, you've written a couple of books as well on enterprise risk management. You've created a framework for risk management and proper oversight. Specifically, you have 3 components that you lay out. Tell us a little bit about those components and what should organizations be looking for in their enterprise risk management? Yeah,
the model that I've developed for board risk oversight, so the role of the board in enterprise risk management, I use the acronyms GPA to kind of keep it simple. And instead of grade point average that's commonly known for, it stands for governance, policy, and assurance. So I think those are the 3 key levers for the board in terms of risk oversight. So governance relates to how do we organize ourselves to oversee risk? Should we have a risk committee? Or is it the mandate of the audit committee? Or is it the full board? And how do we align the structure for management and the board and make sure that the risk, compliance, and audit functions within the management has an independent reporting relationship to the board? So first and foremost, make sure that our governance is strong. Second is policy. How do we communicate our standards, our expectations, our risk appetite to management? So risk appetite, I think, is one of the most important policies, that you define what types of risk at what levels are we willing to accept in pursuit of our business strategy in our day-to-day business operations. Finally, A is for assurance. How do we know if risk management is working effectively? Right? Are we getting the right reports, the right metrics, the right trends to monitor the performance of the program? And also, are we getting the right feedback loops in terms of risk management effectiveness?
I think the feedback loop is something that you point to is very important in risk oversight, but probably one of the most difficult in terms of implementing.
I think for any function or process in business, if you want to improve it, you need to have a feedback loop. So first step is, what is the objective of the process? And what are the things that make up the process in terms of people, process, technology, culture? And then monitor the results. And if the results are not consistent with the objectives, then you may want to consider making changes in the underlying areas, whether it's changing people, process, technology, or influencing the culture. So for risk management, it's the same thing. What is the objective? And I think one of the key objectives of risk management is to minimize unexpected earnings volatility. So that's very different than earnings volatility, because sometimes you might want to take on more risks and you may be exposed to higher degrees of earnings volatility. That's not a bad thing. What is a bad thing is if you have earnings volatility coming from sources that you don't understand, right? So you're taking interest rate risk or foreign exchange risk, or something happens in terms of a regulatory issue. Those are things that you want to minimize. So if you define the objectives of enterprise risk management as to minimizing unexpected earnings volatility, then you could measure that, right? You could look at earnings at risk in the beginning of a period. You could look at what really happened at the end of the period in terms of earnings attribution and be able to isolate unexpected earnings volatility. And so that provides you a continuous feedback loop to the degree that you see higher levels of unexpected earnings volatility, then you may want to make changes to the process.
Mm-hmm. Why is the feedback loop so difficult? Why is that the hardest part of the process to implement?
Well, it's really connecting the dots. So many companies do earnings volatility analysis. So they have expected earnings and they measure what happens if we don't meet our projections, what happens if interest rates change or foreign exchange rates change. So they understand that, and they also understand, budget versus actual. Right? They do that every month, every quarter, but they don't put it together. So it's really connecting the dots, and if you could put it together, then you could isolate the measurement of unexpected earnings variance.
What should the top priorities for a risk oversight committee be at the board level?
Well, for me, when I joined the board of E-Trade 4 years ago, I had a handful of key initiatives. One is to make sure we have a good agenda for the committee, right? Board time and attention is limited, so we want to make sure that we are focusing on the most critical risks, right? Not just financial risks and regulatory risks, but also operational risk and strategic risk. So we wanted to have an organized, well thought out calendar and agenda for risk management. Two is I really wanted to enhance the independence of our risk and compliance functions. So many companies, when you see org chart, you see the chief risk officer or the chief compliance officer with a dotted line reporting to the board, but it's not clear what those dotted line really mean. So I wanted to make sure that they have a direct communication to the board, and I also wanted them to have an independent voice in terms of being able to escalate issues, escalate concerns. So that was a second initiative. The third thing was to make sure we have a robust set of risk management policies, for credit risk, market risk, operational risk, cybersecurity, and as we said earlier, having a very robust risk appetite statement was very critical. The fourth initiative is to make sure we have good reporting, that the reporting that we get tells a story, tells the board what are the key risk exposures, what are the key trends that we need to pay attention to, and for each committee meeting, what are the key decision points and discussion points. And then finally, I was able to talk to management about instituting this feedback loop, connecting earnings at risk analysis with earnings attribution analysis. And it's been a very effective process. Right now it's used by management to help them manage the risk within the company in a way that's tied to business strategy and business performance. And internally, it's affectionately known as the Lamb Report. So I think it's been a very useful process.
What are some big challenges that a risk oversight committee faces?
Well, I think one is to work collaboratively with management. Risk management issues are not natural for people to want to talk about, right? You want to talk about business opportunities, growth, earnings, right? Things that you could do that's very positive. Risks sometimes have to do with losses, incidents, concerns, or even prospectively things that could get you into trouble. So there's really upside to risk, and there's also a downside to risk. And if you strictly focus on the downside, sometimes that's not an easy conversation. So I think one of the key challenges is be able to speak about risk more openly, candidly with management. Another challenge is getting the right information, the right reporting, so that you're looking at the same set of information in your risk management meetings and discussions. And I think another challenge is to influence the culture of the company. So even if you set up all the right infrastructure, you still have to rely on people at the end of the day in terms of their behavior, how do you provide the right incentives, and I think those are some of the key things.
What are some reasons that boards fail, and what should they be doing to ensure their effectiveness?
I think boards fail when they are either not fully engaged, right? If they don't understand the business strategy of the organization, if they don't understand the underlying assumptions and the sensitivity of the assumptions, or if they don't understand the environment in terms of external risk and trends that could really affect the business. So I think it's a matter of having good insight in terms of what drives the performance of the company, the revenue drivers, the expense drivers, the risk drivers, and also foresight to be able to look forward and around corners in terms of what things could really impact the organization. So I think boards need to be engaged, active, but at the same time, again, respecting the role of management and not micromanage, because if you micromanage, then the relationship between the board and management would not be very effective.
How much of the board do you feel had impact on some of the things that have been going on recently in organizations that we've seen, going back to Enron or Volkswagen or Wells Fargo? What role do you feel the board played in that?
I think we've seen a sea change in how boards fulfill their obligations. I think historically boards were not as engaged and active. They were more ceremonial, right? You might go play golf, look at some reports, and kind of going through the motions historically. But I think today's boards are much more active, much more engaged, asking the right questions, challenging management on their assumptions, asking for the right feedback loops. And if they don't get the information that they need, I think they have to make some difficult choices and changes. So I think boards today are under a lot of pressure from institutional investors, activist investors, regulators, shareholders, and I think they are really fulfilling the role in a much better manner. I think it's really important to have a good expression of your risk appetite. So risk is not a bad thing. You have to take risks to be in business. but you have to understand what they are. You have to understand what levels of exposures are appropriate, and you have to understand what's the risk-return trade-offs that the company face. So I think first and foremost, having good policies and monitoring company performance on an ongoing basis. And things are going to happen, right? So I think it's really important to have good risk escalation, that when things go wrong, it gets escalated and gets resolved before it becomes problematic. So that's a matter of having the right risk escalation processes and policies in place, and getting the right reporting and responding to the emerging risks that's going to come about.
What are some of the things that you look for when you're evaluating the performance of the Chief Risk Officer?
Well, I think the performance of the Chief Risk Officer and the performance of the risk management program go hand in hand, right? And historically, the board or management would say the Chief Risk Officer accomplished certain objectives. So qualitative milestones, right? Did they put in a new system, a new reporting? Did he or she put in a good risk policy, right? So qualitative milestones. The second thing that historically companies would look for would be the lack of negative things, right? We didn't have a surprise in terms of losses or an incident or regulatory issue. But I think qualitative milestones and negative proofs are necessary but insufficient, right? You might have these things, but it doesn't tell you that what's there is working effectively. So I think you need to add feedback loops, right, that we've talked about. You also have to think about whether or not the Chief Risk Officer is building a risk organization that's going to move the company forward, and there's good succession planning. If something happens to the Chief Risk Officer, whether he or she leaves the company or get promoted, making sure there's deep talent underneath that person. And ultimately, what's the risk culture of the organization? Do we have a positive risk culture in terms of the way people behave? And also, to what degree risk management is not an overlaid or quarterly or annual process, to what degree the Chief Risk Officer is able to integrate risk management into the business decisions of the organization.
What role does the board have when it comes to succession planning at the C-level?
First of all, I think the board needs to make sure that there's a good process in place. So at the C-level, from the Chief Executive Officer and the C-suite of executives, that there are internal candidates that could potentially take on those important jobs. And sometimes you might find that they might be 6 months, 12 months, 2 years away from being ready, making sure that you have the right coaching, training and development programs, career opportunities within the organization so that the individuals would be ready. If you don't have a good internal candidate, then you have to make sure that you consider external candidates and have a recruiting strategy in addition to developing your bench strength.
So we've talked about a risk oversight committee and some of the things that you do. How is the performance of the board as a whole assessed?
Well, boards go through a self-assessment process, or they may retain a firm to do board assessments. And I think it's important to first consider how's the board working effectively as a group, and then also with each of its committees, right? So you may have a governance committee, a audit committee, a risk committee, and a compensation committee. So each of the committees, how that's working. And also the individual directors. Are they contributing to the board based on their backgrounds, experiences, and skills? So it's really a holistic assessment, and you want to make sure that relative to the mandates of each of those committees, are they doing a good job? Are they speaking candidly as a group, being able to challenge each other and work collaboratively as a group and also working collaboratively with management.
You work with a group of your peers at the board level. How do you manage those relationships to make sure that you are collaborating and making sure that you're furthering the agenda that you have laid out for the company?
Yeah, well, I'm very fortunate. E-Trade is my first public company board. We have 12 members, diverse backgrounds and skills, and I think diversity is a value. It really contributes to the effectiveness of the board. And I think we each bring different sets of experiences and skills to the table, and really to be able to appreciate differences in opinions, diversities of opinions, being able to trust that we have the best interests of the company at heart. I think that's really important. And I think having a shared agenda, knowing what the company's strategy is, respecting the roles of the different committees. And ultimately, as a board, we need to work effectively with management. So, we have to be able to have that trust and collaboration with the management as well.
Now, you've been a director on both public companies and private companies. What would you say are the major differences being a board director on the companies?
Yeah, well, the two private companies that I worked on were startups. Right? And as startups, you're really focused on, what is the right business model, what are the right risks that we have to take, right? You want to be a lot more aggressive. You want to be fast to the market, you want to execute your strategy, you want to grow the business. So that's a very different in terms of focus. As a public company, you have fiduciary responsibility to the shareholders. You want to act in the best interest of the company and make sure that you're adding shareholder value, right? Ultimately, that you're managing the risk, you're executing against the strategy. You have a much longer term perspective in terms of business performance.
Tell us the process that you went through to actually get elected as a board member for E-Trade.
Well, I got a call from an executive recruiter, and he showed me a job description, but he had a funny thing to say. He said, the E-Trade board is looking for a director with risk in his or her DNA, right? So they really wanted a subject matter expert to help them with the risk management program. And I had some really good meetings with the directors and also with management. And it was a really good fit in terms of what they were looking for and also the opportunity for me to contribute.
What kinds of competencies are required to be a board member in today's environment?
I think as we talked about, diversity is really important. And so directors today have very deep technical expertise, whether it is risk or cyber and IT, marketing, finance, etc. But it's also important to be able to apply your specialty in a broader strategic and business context, to be able to contribute both in the overall strategy of the company, but at the same time making sure these specialization areas are being addressed appropriately.
So what do you think of the following statement? The board of directors is the first line of defense against organizational risks.
I would not agree with that statement. There is a 3 lines of defense model that I talk about in my book. The first line of defense are the business units and operating units. They are the closest to the customers, the supply chain, the day-to-day business operations. So the first line of defense, they own the risk. The second line of defense is the independent risk and compliance functions in support of corporate management. So they provide ongoing monitoring of the first line of defense. And to me, the board of directors is the third line of defense, with the support of the internal audit function in providing assurance that the risk management program is working effectively. And so that's how I think about the board's role.
What are some of the biggest mistakes boards make when it comes to capital and resource allocation, and how could those be avoided?
I think capital allocation, resource allocation is probably one of the most important things that corporate management with board oversight need to do, right? So it's basically thinking about the company as an internal capital market itself, right? So you have different customer segments, different products, different markets, different countries that you could allocate your financial and human capital to. I think one of the most important things that we need to think about is risk-adjusted return. So instead of looking at just the top line, sales and revenue growth, or even the bottom line in terms of net income, how do you look at risk in relationship to profitability? And if you could achieve higher levels of risk-adjusted return relative to your cost of capital, then you could enhance shareholder value. And I think one of the key lessons learned within banking and also outside banking is the efficient allocation of capital, financial and human capital, to its most efficient sources and uses.
So you're also an author, and you've come out with a couple of books on risk management. Mm-hmm. Tell us about those books.
Well, my first book came out in 2003. It's called Enterprise Risk Management. And my new book's coming out this year. It's called Implementing Enterprise Risk Management. So my first book was on what is enterprise risk management? What are the best practices? What are the specific industry requirements in banking, in insurance, energy firms, etc. My second book is really on how, right? So how do you implement an effective risk management program? How do you overcome some of the organizational or cultural barriers? And how do you integrate risk management into business decisions so you could create value? So it's a companion books.
And you also run a consulting firm which deals exclusively with risk management. Tell us about the types of companies and industries you consult for.
Oh, I work with many different industries, so banks, insurance companies, asset management firms, energy firms, technology firms. And I generally work with the chief risk officer and the board of directors. I mean, mainly is kind of doing a risk assessment, where's their program relative to best practices, creating a roadmap in terms of specific initiatives and milestones that they can move toward a target state relative to where they are, and really working collaboratively with the client organization, getting things done, right? Putting in place policies and reports and systems.
You're also known as the first chief risk officer at companies like GE Capital and Fidelity Investments. Tell us a little bit about some of the lessons learned while you were in those roles and any advice that you can have for professionals looking to become a chief risk officer.
Well, I became a chief risk officer at GE Capital in 1993, and I'll tell you the story as to how I came up with the title. So I joined GE Capital to help them set up a new capital markets business. And I was in charge of the middle office and back office. So the middle office had strategy and risk management, and the back office had the operations. And the front office was the trading team, right? So I went to my boss and said, hey, I need to order some business cards. What should I put on it? And he goes, what do you want to put on it, right? So at that point, Chief Information Officer, CIO, was becoming popular in terms of integrating different systems and elevating it to a C-suite agenda. So I said, why not Chief Risk Officer? And so that's how I came up with that title. For risk professionals, one thing they should consider is, what does my target skill set look like? Right? So for me, I've always thought risk management was my deep technical expertise, but I also want to think about it relative to strategy. So what is your T? what is your vertical axis where you want to develop deep technical capability and experience and knowledge, but be able to express it in a much broader business context. So I think developing the right skill set is number one. Number two is be able to communicate through writing, speaking, one-on-one communication, being able to communicate your ideas in a way that would resonate with your audience. So I think having good verbal and written communication skills, I think is very important. I think you also need to consider organizational dynamics. What is the culture of the organization? How do I motivate people? How do I overcome resistance? I think organizational dynamics is another key area. And also branding. What is my personal brand within my company, and also within the overall industry and profession. I think those are the things that I would advise risk professionals to consider.
Well, James, this was great. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And we'll see you next time on SarderTV.